You learned to be okay alone before you learned it was okay to need someone. Picture this. You're 7 years old, coming home to an empty house. The key is around your neck or hidden under the doormat. You let yourself in. You make yourself a snack, maybe a bowl of cereal, maybe just crackers. You turn on the television, and the apartment hums with that particular kind of silence that only a child home alone understands. Not peaceful, not frightening, just expected. You didn't call it loneliness then, you called it independence. And somewhere in that space between the school bell and your parents' return from work, something fundamental shifted in you. You learned that the world wouldn't pause for your needs, that self-sufficiency wasn't a skill to develop over time, it was a requirement for survival. That asking for help wasn't maturity, it was weakness. You became capable, resourceful, the kid who could handle things. And everyone praised you for it. But here's the paradox that lives in your nervous system even now. The independence that protected you then is the isolation that haunts you now. You grew up in the 1970s, a decade caught between the revolutionary chaos of the 60s and the corporate ambition of the 80s. Your parents were navigating their own unraveling. Rising divorce rates, economic instability, the erosion of extended family structures, and a cultural mythology that valorized self-made individualism above all else. They didn't abandon you. They were surviving. And they taught you to survive too. So you did. You learned to be emotionally self-sufficient before you learned multiplication. You learned that your feelings were your responsibility to manage, not theirs to hold. You internalized a worldview that said, if you can't fix it yourself, it's not worth fixing. And you've carried that ever since. The 1970s child is not defined by a single event, but by a pattern of relational absence, a psychological phenomenon known as emotional neglect. This isn't about overt abuse or cruelty. It's about what wasn't there, the presence of absence. Emotional neglect occurs when a child's emotional needs, comfort, validation, attunement, presence, are consistently unmet, not necessarily through malice, but through unavailability. And the 1970s was structurally designed to create this unavailability. Mothers entering the workforce en masse without corresponding societal support. Fathers still trapped in stoic breadwinner masculinity. Latchkey kids became a generational identity, not a crisis. You absorbed a concept that psychologists now call parentification, the reversal of roles where children take on adult emotional or practical responsibilities prematurely. You didn't just take care of yourself, you often took care of your parents' emotions too. You learned to read their stress, their exhaustion, their marriage falling apart. You learned not to add to their burden. You became small in your needs so they could stay standing. This creates what's called an avoidant attachment style. In attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, children develop internal working models of relationships based on early caregiver responsiveness. When caregivers are consistently unavailable, not abusive, just absent, children learn that their needs are inconvenient, that closeness is unreliable, that the safest strategy is self-reliance. So you learned to self-soothe, to dismiss your own distress, to treat connection as optional rather than essential. Neurologically, this rewires the brain. The default mode network, the brain's resting state network involved in self-referential thinking and emotional processing, becomes hyperactive in people with histories of emotional neglect. Your brain learned to constantly monitor, am I safe? Am I too much? Do I belong? This creates a baseline state of low-level anxiety that feels so normal you don't even recognize it as anxiety anymore. You think it's just who you are. But it's not who you are, it's what you learn to be. The 1970s child operates from what schema therapy calls an emotional deprivation schema, a core belief that your emotional needs will never be met by others, so you simply stop having them, or rather, you stop acknowledging them. They don't disappear. They go underground. They become the static beneath every relationship, every risk, every moment of potential vulnerability. The cost is this. You traded your authenticity for acceptability, and you've been paying interest ever since. You learned that to be loved, or at least not to be too much trouble, you needed to be easy, low maintenance, the child who didn't cry when mom was stressed, who didn't complain when dinner was cereal again, who understood that adults had bigger problems than your hurt feelings about being forgotten at soccer practice. Carl Jung wrote, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. And this is your inheritance. Not that you didn't suffer, but that you weren't allowed to acknowledge it as suffering. So it fermented into something else. Shame. Guilt. A vague, persistent sense that you're fundamentally undeserving of care." This is the invisible grief of the 1970s child. Grief for the childhood you didn't get to have. Grief for the spontaneity, the neediness, the unfiltered emotional expression that you suppressed because no one had the capacity to hold it. Grief for the version of yourself that learned silence was safer than speech. And the cruelest part? You don't even recognize it as grief, because nothing objectively terrible happened to you. You weren't beaten. You weren't starved. You had a roof over your head. So you gaslight yourself into thinking you have no right to hurt. But trauma isn't a competition, and neglect is insidious precisely because it's invisible. It's the wound of what didn't happen, which is so much harder to name than the wound of what did. Your core fear, the one that pulses beneath every decision, every relationship, every moment of potential rest, is this: if I need too much, I will be abandoned. So you preemptively abandon yourself first. You minimize. You self-sacrifice. You perform independence even when you're drowning. Because asking for help feels like exposing a shameful inadequacy. And this fear complicates everything. The simple joy of receiving a compliment becomes contaminated with suspicion. What did they want from me? The relief of someone offering support becomes anxiety. Now I owe them. The possibility of rest becomes guilt. I should be doing something productive. You exist in a state of perpetual self-monitoring, hyper-vigilant to the needs of others, blind to your own. This is what the philosopher Simone Weil meant when she wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. You give attention freely to everyone else, but you withhold it from yourself, because somewhere deep down, you still believe you don't deserve it." The 1970s child becomes an adult who looks extraordinarily functional on the outside and feels secretly hollow on the inside. You might be the person everyone describes as so independent, so capable, never asks for anything. And you smile, because that's the whole point, isn't it? But what they don't see is that this isn't strength, it's armor. In relationships, you become the perpetual giver, the one who plans, who organizes, who remembers everyone's birthdays and emotional states. You're attuned to your partner's needs with microscopic precision, but you struggle to articulate your own. When someone asks, "What do you need?" you genuinely don't know. The question feels foreign, like trying to speak a language you never learned. You might gravitate toward partners who need saving, because caretaking is the only form of intimacy that feels safe. Or you might choose distance entirely. Partners who are emotionally unavailable, who mirror back the neglect you normalized. Because deep familiarity, even painful familiarity, feels more comfortable than genuine reciprocity. You struggle with conflict. Any disagreement feels like potential abandonment, so you avoid it. You accommodate. You twist yourself into smaller and smaller shapes to maintain connection, until one day you realize you've disappeared entirely into the relationship. And the resentment that follows is so confusing because you did this to yourself. They didn't ask you to shrink. You just assumed you had to. In your career, you're likely the overachiever, the one who stays late, who takes on extra projects without being asked, who measures their worth entirely in productivity and output. Because rest feels like failure. Because you learned that your value is contingent on your usefulness. You might struggle with imposter syndrome, that persistent feeling that you're secretly incompetent and about to be exposed, because you internalized that approval is conditional, that you have to earn belonging through constant performance. Receiving praise is uncomfortable. You deflect it, minimize it, because deep down, you don't believe you deserve it. Not for just existing anyway, only for doing. In your relationship with yourself, there's a harsh inner critic, a voice that sounds suspiciously like the parent who was too tired to listen, who says, "Don't be dramatic. Other people have it worse. You're fine. Just keep going." You might experience what psychologists call alexithymia, difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. When someone asks, "How are you feeling?" you respond with thoughts instead. "I think that was frustrating," rather than, "I feel angry." Because emotions were something you learned to intellectualize rather than inhabit. You struggle with self-compassion. You can extend infinite patience and understanding to others, but toward yourself, you're merciless. Because somewhere along the way, you internalize the belief that you're only acceptable if you're easy. And having needs, having limits, having feelings, that's not easy. In your boundaries, there's confusion. You either have walls or no boundaries at all, because you never learned the middle ground. You're either hyper-independent, needing no one, or you're overgiving to the point of self-abandonment. The idea of a boundaried connection, where you can be both connected and autonomous, feels theoretically possible, but practically unreachable. You might people-please compulsively, say yes when you mean no, apologize for existing in space, because asserting your needs feels aggressive, like you're being the difficult person you swore you'd never become. In your emotional regulation, there's either numbness or overwhelm. You either feel nothing, disassociated, going through the motions, or you feel everything all at once in a tidal wave that terrifies you, because you never learned the skill of emotional titration. Feeling in manageable doses, you learned suppression. And suppression works until it doesn't. But here's what's crucial to understand. These aren't personality flaws. These are adaptations. You're not broken. You're brilliant. Your nervous system created these strategies to keep you safe in an environment that required premature self-sufficiency. The problem isn't the strategies themselves. It's that the environment changed, but the strategies didn't. And the first step in unlearning is awareness. Not the awareness that says, "What's wrong with me?" but the awareness that says, "Oh, this makes sense. This is what I learned. And I can learn something different now." You're not gaslighting yourself anymore. You're witnessing yourself. And that witnessing is the beginning of something different.
Healing
doesn't mean erasing your past. It means rewriting your relationship to it. The work begins with reparenting yourself. This isn't metaphorical, it's practical. It means becoming the presence for yourself that you needed then, but didn't receive. When that inner critic says, "You're too sensitive," you practice responding with, "No, I'm human, and my feelings are valid." When you feel the compulsion to push through exhaustion, you practice asking, "What would I say to a child who is this tired?" And then you offer yourself that same compassion. This is inner child work, and it's not about regression or victimhood, it's about integration. It's about acknowledging that part of you is still 7 years old, letting yourself in to an empty house, trying to be brave. And that child deserves to be told, "You don't have to be alone anymore. I'm here now." Shadow work is equally essential. This means confronting the parts of yourself you've disowned, the neediness, the anger, the grief, the parts you learned were unacceptable. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's the warehouse of everything you were told you couldn't be, and reclaiming it is how you become whole. You must also focus on nervous system regulation. Decades of hyper-vigilance have kept your system in a chronic state of activation. Healing requires learning to signal safety to your body. This means breath work, somatic practices, vagal nerve exercises. It means learning that rest isn't laziness, it's a biological necessity. That softness isn't weakness, it's courage. You're allowed to need people. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to be inconvenient, messy, imperfect, and still worthy of love. The goal isn't to become someone who never struggles. The goal is to become someone who struggles with self-compassion instead of self-punishment, who chooses vulnerability over performance, who understands that connection requires risk and takes it anyway. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage." Your independence was the dragon, and for so long it protected you, but it's also kept you isolated. And the courage now is not to slay it, but to see it for what it really was, a scared child's brilliant solution to an impossible situation. You survived, and survival was necessary. But now you get to do more than survive. You get to live, to feel, to need, to belong, not by earning it, but by simply existing. The 1970s taught you that you were on your own, but you get to teach yourself something different now. You were never meant to do this alone. And maybe that's the most radical act of all. Not independence, but interdependence. Not armor, but authenticity. Not performing okayness, but admitting when you're not. You don't have to be fixed. You were never broken. You just learned rules that no longer serve you. And now, you get to learn different ones. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who grew up learning to be okay alone. And if you're ready to unlearn what survival taught you, subscribe, because we're just getting started. The work is hard, but you've been doing hard things your whole life. The difference now is, you don't have to do them alone.